Hello, thank you everyone for coming. So we're going to have the first session on the problem of overpopulation. And first, Professor Singer will speak, and then Felix Pinkert, who has a somewhat different view, will present his more recent work, and then Andrew Williams will respond to Felix and maybe something to Peter as well. You have your PowerPoint ready?
Yes,
okay,
it's up there.
Right.
Good. Thanks very much. So I'm giving a quite general overview of issues about population, which perhaps will help to provide some background to what Felix is going to discuss later. I'm going to start by saying there are three reasons why we might be concerned about population growth in the 21st century. Okay, so one of them is poverty. Andrew has already mentioned the drowning child, so here we are with the drowning child. I guess the question that is sometimes put to me as an objection when I speak about why we should be helping people in extreme poverty in low-income countries and make this analogy with saving the drowning child from the pond. People say, well, if you save this child today, this child will have several children, and then in 30 years, something like that, instead of there being one child to save from extreme poverty, there'll be 4 children to save, and the problem will just get worse. So why are we saving lives now? Simply to push this problem further into the future. Secondly, there's climate change. I don't think you need to look at this slide in detail. It's one I prepared for teaching in the US, where there are still occasionally people who deny that the climate change is occurring. I'd be surprised if there's anyone in this room in that situation. What the graph actually shows is, as it says, temperatures above and below the average for the entire 20th century. And it's pretty obvious that if you go back before 1940, all of the years were below the average for that century. If you go to after 1980, all of the years were above that average, and in fact, the extent to which they're above the average is increasing quite rapidly. So I find it an alarming slide, but as I say, you probably don't need to be convinced of this anyway. So obviously, more population might mean more people emitting greenhouse gases. Climate change gets worse, or the problem gets harder to solve. And thirdly, and particularly as we have some overlap with yesterday's audience and concern about non-human animals, there's the loss of biodiversity, which has been accelerating. Talk about entering the 6th mass extinction, and population is certainly a factor there. So this just shows the sharp increase in rates of extinction. And if we look at the this slide, okay, so this shows where population is, where it's expected to be by the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs Population Division. This is not totally up to date. This is their 2017 prediction. I think they've slightly amended it, but it's not very far out from what they're still predicting. So what you see is that by the end of the century, the world is expected to be around 11 billion people, as compared to, we're closing in on 8 billion at the moment, not quite there. So, but the most distinctive thing, I think, when you look at this is that this growth is not at all global. It's highly regional, and it's specifically Africa, or if we wanted to be more precise, it's not shown on this chart, sub-Saharan Africa. So if you look at the population of Europe, it's predicting a fall at all the future dates, 2030, 2050, and 2100. Latin American and the Caribbean is not going to grow, well, it's going to grow temporarily and then fall back is the prediction. North America is growing more significantly, and that's largely immigration rather than natural reproduction. And Asia is also growing on this prediction. Although it will grow to 2050, it'll then drop back. So population predictions for China, for example, by the end of the century are significantly lower than the present population of China. But it's Africa that is the really rapid grow from 1.25 billion here to close to 4.5 billion. So Africa will have almost as many people as Asia on this prediction by the end of the century. If you look at which countries are growing fastest, this connects with what I was saying about poverty-related issues, because it's the poorest countries that are growing fastest, largely. Countries like, I think Niger is the country that ranks lowest on Human Development Index and other estimates of poverty. And you look at that population growing from 21 million in 2017 to 192 million at the end of the century. It's really hard to see how Niger will provide a decent standard of living for that many people, if that prediction is correct. And there are a number of other poor countries. Angola is not that poor, in fact, because it is one of the largest African oil producers, but because of the incredible inequality in the distribution of that revenue, most people in Angola are still very poor, and that population is expected to grow. Tanzania is expected to be 300 million by the end of the century, and Nigeria on this prediction will be the third largest country in the world in terms of population, following China and India, and as you see, well ahead of the United States. So I think these predictions, and again, you know, the UN predictions, they're not mine, and I can't really say. Some demographers do question some of these predictions. They're expecting the decline in population that's occurred in more affluent countries to happen earlier here than is predicted here. Decline in fertility, I should say. But they are somewhat alarming figures. Now, one of the things that I want to talk about is the fact that there hasn't been nearly as much discussion of population as an ethical issue over the last close to 30 years as there was previously. And you know, one evidence for that and for the idea that there's a reluctance to discuss population is if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals that the United Nations said, and we're supposed to be working towards. There's 17 different goals. None of them specifically refers to population. You could see population as being relevant, as being part of goals like no poverty or zero hunger or good health and well-being. In fact, you know, many of these, gender equality, may help to slow population growth, but it's not explicitly mentioned. And even when you go to the sub-goals, because each of these 17 goals has a lot of specific targets, and I think the total is something like 168, there's still nothing really specific about slowing population growth in poor countries or anything of that sort. So it's worth looking at, well, why is that? Why is this not an issue that is discussed so much? And there are various reasons that are offered. One is, well, there's been a lot of talk about population growth, a lot of alarmist talk about population growth in the past, and it's been shown to be false. So why should we believe anybody who's raising concern about it today? And it's certainly true that predictions of the past have been false, starting off with Thomas Malthus' famous essay on the principle of population, which had this sort of neat idea, I guess, that population increases geometrically and subsistence only arithmetically. And if that were true, then of course, you know, by now we would have mass starvation, or the starvation would have reduced the population down again. But clearly that wasn't true. Subsistence, in other words, food supply, has increased at far more than just an arithmetical ratio. And if you go right to 1968, when Paul Ehrlich published The Population Bomb, a sensational book, as you look at the little subtitle or the subtext on these different covers, the earlier one, which is the one on the left, says, while you were reading these words, 4 people will have died from starvation, most of them children. And if you go to the next edition of it, it's gone up to 5 people, and 40 more babies have been born. So Ehrlich predicted that there would be mass famines in the 1970s, that hundreds of millions of people would die in these famines, and that the battle to provide enough food for everyone in the world had been lost. So very gloomy words. Oh, there's the quote I had there. The battle to feed all of humanity is over. So they're very dire predictions. Fortunately, they did not come true. It's not that there were no famines, of course there were, and there's threats of famine today. They're not so much produced from lack of food. I guess the current threat at the moment is the fact that Ukraine is a major grain producer, and Russia is blockading its Black Sea ports. Also, the war in Yemen is causing famine, and clearly there can be local famines because of droughts and things of that sort, exacerbated, no doubt, by climate change. But the world is still producing enough food to feed everybody. We could distribute it a lot better than we are doing, obviously. But the hundreds of millions of people starving anyway didn't come true. So how do you respond to this idea that there have been all these alarmists before and they were wrong? So obviously, with some humility, anyone who predicts dire consequences from population growth should acknowledge that they may be wrong. You can't be dogmatic about this. But we should be cautious. The precautionary principle is often talked about in terms of developments that may affect the world. I don't know that that's itself really entirely sound, but clearly we should be alert to risks of very bad things happening, even if there's no certainty that they will happen. And we should be thinking about whether it's good to take steps to reduce that risk, even if it is only a risk and by no means a certainty. Another reason why people say we shouldn't talk about population is that it's a violation of the human right to procreate to do this, to talk about population. And terms like population control, which were widely used in the after Ehrlich's book and in the 70s, are no longer used because that's seen as coercive and a violation of people's right to procreate. I think there's a few things to say in response to that. One is that in a world in which everybody's greenhouse gas emissions can harm other people who are completely unconnected with them, there can't be an absolute right to unlimited procreation, not at least until we've found ways to produce the energy that people want without greenhouse gas emissions. And I think in general you could say that rights are never really absolute. They always have to be balanced against other considerations, including the interests of others, future generations of humans, and clearly the interests of non-human animals as well. And if you think there's intrinsic value in biodiversity, then balanced against that intrinsic value too. And a second reason for not thinking that everybody has the right to produce as many children as they wish is that how many children they wish to produce is clearly something that is subject to a variety of influences, and one of them is education. And if we agree, and most people do agree, that educating children is a good thing, and when we say educating children, we don't just mean male children, it's important to include girls, then that's something that will change women's wish about how many children they may have, and perhaps men's as well. So, those are things that we might think it's good to do anyway, not violating anyone's rights, and clearly putting more resources into that will have a bigger effect, both in empowering girls and also in terms of slowing population growth. And increasing access to contraception and providing incentives to have small families may also be non-rights violating methods of achieving those goals. And the third reason, and perhaps one of the most powerful in terms of actually the effect that it's having, is the suggestion that for affluent white people to tell Africans, and because as you can see from the slide that I showed, it largely is Africans who would be addressed by this and whom it's necessary to address if you want to slow population growth. To do that is racist and neo-colonialist. And of course we've had a lot of history of racism and neo-colonialism coming from white people, and the suggestion is that we're continuing this tradition of we know better what's good for you, which so often has produced terrible consequences in Africa and other countries that were colonized. So in contrast to doing that, the suggestion is we should be looking at our own consumption and not on the population of low-income countries. So there's clearly a good point behind that response, behind that objection to discussing population. When you look at the greenhouse gas emissions of some of those low-income countries whose populations are growing fast as compared to the United States. For example, I've just picked the United States here. If you took European countries, certainly the metric tons per capita would be significantly lower, might be as low as half of the United States figures, depending where you're talking about, but still significantly higher than these very low-income countries. So if you look at that, and then you bring that into conjunction with the rate of population growth that I showed you in the earlier slide of some of those countries, you get figures like this. So the United States population is projected to increase by those UN figures by 123 million, which if they maintain their per capita greenhouse gas emissions rates, will be 2 billion tonnes of greenhouse gases extra. Nigeria's population increase is far greater, but if they maintain their low per capita emissions, it'll be far less, be only 300 million tonnes, so roughly 1/7 of the increase in greenhouse gases coming from the United States population increase. And Nigeria, if it sorry, where have we got that? Oh, Niger, sorry, with its extremely low emissions rate, will be trivial compared to what the United States is emitting. Now, of course, you may look at that and you may say, well, it's not likely that these countries will maintain such low greenhouse gas emissions rates. Surely they are going to be able to use energy sources, fossil fuel energy sources, sometime over the next century, and that will increase their greenhouse gas emissions per capita. That's possible. I think we don't really know. In a way, it would be a sign that they are getting out of poverty if that's true, and you could see it as a good thing, but of course, in terms of the emissions, it's a bad thing. So that's one of the things, the points I say on this slide. We don't know whether they'll live low energy lifestyles. And again, there's this question of risk. Are we justified in gambling with the future and with more severe developments in climate change caused by the increase in population and an increase in the per capita greenhouse gas emissions? So there are issues that you can certainly raise about the idea that because of these low emissions, we don't have to worry about population increase as far as climate change is concerned. But it's certainly still true that the increase of population in the US poses a greater risk to climate, to sustainability and to reducing climate change than the projected population increase in Africa. And that, of course, points to the urgency of the United States and other affluent countries with much higher per capita emissions than these low-income countries of getting down to net zero emissions reasonably soon. by the middle of the century, if not earlier. Okay, so having presented that and some of the reasons why people might not want to talk about population, but why maybe we still do need to talk about population to some extent, we get to this question of what are the values that are involved, something that philosophers have worked on quite a lot and that others may not be that familiar with. Actually, Paolo, in introducing the panel, referred to the word overpopulation, but of course the idea that a given population is an overpopulation includes value judgment as to what counts as an overpopulation, by what values, by what standards. So that's why if you're discussing this, these questions can't really be avoided. So one issue that you do need to consider is life positive for humans in the world generally? Because if life were negative for human beings in the world generally, then I think philosophers would agree that we don't want population to increase because it just increases the misery, which is the average state of people in the world anyway. But that doesn't seem to be the case from the World Happiness Report, which does surveys of life satisfaction around the world. And if you look at this, essentially those countries that have a shade of green in them, even a light green, are above 5 on the scale of 10. This is a result of asking people essentially to show how satisfied they are with their life on a kind of a bar that goes from, like this one, from 0 to 10. And so as you see, most of the world, actually, people do say that their lives are positive, that is, that they're above 5 on a 10-point scale. It's when you get down to the yellowish colours that you get below 5, and the more orangey colours are around between 2 and 3, for example. Some of the lowest countries there, and they're all in sub-Saharan Africa. Whereas Asia is generally positive, India only slightly so, and the Americas, Australia, Europe are significantly more positive, above 6. So I think you could say that at least globally, the average view of life is that it's positive. You could question, of course, to what extent people give accurate answers to this question. That's a whole other debate. Whoops, what happened there? Okay, this is another way of showing this from our world in data, where it's happiness versus life satisfaction. They're slightly different indicators whether you ask people how satisfied with their life they are, as opposed to asking them whether they're happy, very happy, not at all. But still, you find that most people are positive on this scale. In fact, somewhat more positive on the happy scale. So India comes out with 80% of people saying that they're happy, and China somewhat more than that. So it sort of supports the results of asking the question slightly differently. Okay, so here's the question. Here's the issue about population increase, which I think all the philosophers in this room will be familiar with, but not everybody is a philosopher. This is from Derek Parfit's work. The fullest statement of that is in his book, Reasons and Persons, Part 4. Essentially what he's asking us to do here is to imagine different worlds without constraints about resources. So these are imaginary world in a hypothetical state where there's adequate resources, there's no worries about climate change or anything like that, or even loss of biodiversity. We're just talking about trying to compare different populations. World A, and we can quantify, you have to assume well-being or happiness on a scale of let's say 0 to 100. And 100 is really, really happy. So in World A, you've got a population of 1 billion people, and they are living really great lives. Everybody's very, very happy in that world. A plus is a world where there's still a billion people living very happy lives. You can think of them even as the same billion people. But they've decided to have more children, and for some reason, which is not due to injustice, maybe just geographical factors or something like that, the additional population is not quite as happy, but they're still very happy. 75 on this scale is still a really good life. So, and it hasn't taken down the level of the 1 billion on 100. So Parfit is saying, is A plus worse than A? And he's arguing, well, how could it be worse than A? There's still 1 billion people at just as good a level, and now you've got another billion who are leading very good lives. They're not going to say they're sorry that they were brought into existence. They're enjoying their lives a lot. And the 1 billion are not going to say they're sorry that the extra people came into existence because it hasn't affected them. They're just as happy as ever. So it's hard to say that A plus is any worse than A. But if you say that, then what about B, which has the same population as A plus and a higher average happiness? Because you can see the average in A plus, if you want to average across the two groups, is 87.5. So they're actually, on average, happier. So B seems to be a better world than A plus, but if A plus is not worse than A, then B can't be worse, and B is better than A plus. B can't be worse than A either. But the problem with this is you can now repeat this with your imaginary world C, where the average keeps dropping. You have B plus and then C, and you get to what Parfit called the repugnant conclusion, where population, you have world Z, which is a world with a huge population, larger than the visual representation on this slide shows, because I can't show a bar long enough to show this on the slide. But you imagine a huge population of people with a very low but still positive quality of life. Parfit refers to it as a world of music and potatoes. So the only music you hear is the kind of music that you get in elevators or something, and all you can eat is potatoes. But life is still positive. And there's enough of you to outweigh the total happiness of people in original world A. So Parfit finds this conclusion repugnant, but he also, found I should say, because sadly he died about 4 years ago. But he also says it's rather hard to see what's wrong with the argument that leads you to population Z. And a lot of philosophers have tried to find reasons why it doesn't lead you to population Z, but it's highly debatable, let's say, whether any of them have succeeded. So if that's the case, then when you talk about overpopulation, you may not mean a population with a lower average, because it's not clear that a population with a lower average is a worse population, a worse world, if the total amount of happiness in that world is greater. Now, as I said, that was without the constraints of the real world, problems of climate change, problems of loss of biodiversity, and so on. So you might want to say, yeah, but that's got nothing to do with the world we're living in, unfortunately. But it does have something to do with at least at the boundary line, with decisions as to what is overpopulation or what would be too many people. Again, if we assume that their lives still remain positive and it's not, and the increase in population is not a recipe for total disaster in some decades to come. Okay, so that raises issues about biodiversity, which I don't want to spend a lot of time in, but obviously how you value biodiversity for this is going to be very relevant, whether you're talking about loss of species or whether you're talking about well-being of the animals of individual species, again, is going to have some sort of effect. And that does go with the problems that I mentioned earlier about, or the issues about rapid population growth in sub-Saharan Africa, because this shows where we have the greatest number of red list plants. This is not about animals, but they tend to go with red list plants. Where there's a lot of plants on the endangered list, then you're likely to have animals on that list as well. And as you see, the greatest concentration of that is also where the population growth rates are the highest. The red countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and the circles indicating the larger numbers of endangered plants. So I'm going to conclude now, but obviously what I'm saying has not really been an argument for any particular point of view. It's rather been an attempt to stimulate you to think about some of these issues. There are some factual issues that need to be thought about. To what extent are those predictions that the UN is making likely to be correct? To what extent can we expect to have clean energy to support increasing populations, both in affluent countries and in poorer countries? And then there's ethical questions about what is an ideal population, or what is the best population for the world in its present state, and can we preserve biodiversity, and what are the values at stake in biodiversity. So I think we need to have a discussion about this, and in a way this paper is really a plea for saying, despite the reasons why we might hesitate to talk about population growth, given that, well, at least those of us here are living in an affluent country, in a European country which has also been a major colonial power, still, despite that, and despite the hesitations that might cause to discuss population growth, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, I think we shouldn't be afraid of having that discussion. Thanks very much. I can take questions now if you like, yeah. Sure.
Yes, because the talks are a bit different. It's better if we take some questions now for Peter. Anyone has questions? Otherwise, I have one or more. Okay. Nuria, no? Okay. And Tom. Okay.
See?
Yeah.
Now. Okay, thank you for the presentation. Very clear, as always, from you, Professor Singer. But, of course, you must have an opinion about it. So please tell us, share with us your point, even if it's not a conclusive point, but I'm sure that you have some ideas about this that are a little bit more conclusive.
Thank you. I was trying to avoid expressing too much of an opinion, but I suppose I do think that we ought to put emphasis on what are clearly the acceptable ways of slowing population growth in low-income countries, and that is firstly improving education and making sure that girls participate in that education. So educating girls, I think, should be a high priority for people who are concerned both about global poverty, about gender equality, and about population. I also had access to contraception in the slide where I talked about that. And that is also clearly everybody, I think, would support the idea that people should have access to contraception. But in fact, it's clearly not going to be enough to solve the problem. I think there's a World Health Organization estimate that there's something like 210 million women who are sexually active at an age where they could conceive and do not have access to contraception. But it's not as simple as saying, okay, well, we'll go there and we'll give out condoms or contraceptive pills or something like that, because included in not having access to contraception might be their husband doesn't want them to use contraception because their husband wants to show that he's a big man by having a large family. And clearly that's a cultural thing which you don't change just by handing out pills or condoms. So, while I think we should certainly try to pursue that, it seems to me that the education is more fundamental, because if the education empowers women to have more of a say in those questions, which is certainly not easy for them in some cultures, then that will also work. So, yeah, to that extent, I do have a view about what we ought to do, which clearly implies that the rapid population growth in Africa, particularly, is not a good thing. It's not a good thing for biodiversity. It may not be as bad a thing for climate change as it would be if they had higher greenhouse gas emissions. But it's certainly a bad thing for poverty, because, as I say, you look at a country like Niger, which is very poor now, and on those figures, it's going to have to multiply the facilities it provides for its people, things like schools, hospitals, and so on, fivefold at least, maybe more, in order to deal with the predicted population increase. It's just really hard to see how that's going to happen. Unfortunately, there are some Africans now who are talking about the fact that population increase is making things very difficult for some of those countries where it's increasing quite rapidly. So, you know, it doesn't have to be just us white people telling Africans what to do. There are certainly African voices who are concerned about this and want to take action too. And African women as well, who obviously want to empower women to have more control over how many children they have.
Tom Parr?
Great. Thanks so much for the presentation, Peter. Maybe this is just a question about the relevant empirics here, but do you have a sense of how quickly population rates can change? So, at least in part, the fear is that population growth will lead to high levels of poverty, perhaps exacerbate some of the threats associated with climate change. But do you think it's possible to curb population growth relatively quickly? Or is curbing population growth a kind of inevitably long-term solution? And if so, does that mean that the problems with which it's associated are in some sense inevitable?
Yeah, I think there's yes and no there. So part of the problem is if you've had rapid population growth in past decades, you have a young population. So the average age of people in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, is far lower than it is in more affluent countries, which incidentally may be one of the reasons why COVID has caused fewer fatalities in those places. But it does mean that there's a lot of people passing through their reproductive period, and it would be necessary for something quite drastic to happen quite rapidly for them to, let's say, only have 2 or 2.3 or whatever the replacement level is children. And it doesn't seem that that's likely. So some of those predictions, at least as far as 2050, you might say are going to be are unlikely to really be undercut, you know, or that we're unlikely to get far below that target. But if you push it out to 2100, then yes, we do have precedents of countries where fertility has fallen quite rapidly. Countries in Southeast Asia are good examples as they became a little less poor and more educated. Countries like Thailand, Indonesia and so on, population growth did slow down quite rapidly. So we can hope that something like that may happen in sub-Saharan Africa too. In fact, some demographers are a little surprised that it hasn't happened sooner, and so that Africa is not following that Asian and Southeast Asian trajectory as yet, to the extent that people had thought it might.
Diego, which one's the next? Oh. Okay.
Hi, thank you. So I had a question. Insofar as we're concerned with climate change, I think we're in agreement that the low fertility in highly polluting countries is to be welcomed. But I wondered what your response would be to the kind of twofold challenge that we face in highly polluting countries with low fertility, which have to do with the first one of which is the problem of population aging, right? So often that's cited as a reason why we should be concerned with the decreased fertility in rich countries. And as far as then another way of combating population aging other than pronatalist policies are concerned, namely migration, some people argue that even that is not the right solution as far as our goal of curbing emissions is, because as the case of the US might illustrate, even if the increase in population is due to migrants, that still will lead to an increase in emissions. So I wondered what your thoughts were on these further problems.
Yes, thank you. So I think some of the concern about having an aging population, just in general, you know, the alarm that's been raised, is based on a earlier and perhaps outdated view of aging. When I first became a professor at Monash University in 1977, I was given a projection of, my superannuation up to the point at which I would retire, which was age 65, because that was compulsory retirement for university professors then. Well, I'm 10 years past that, and although I'm no longer at Monash, I haven't retired. And I think that that's true of more people, we had this idea that, oh, well, there's going to be all these 65 pluses, and they're going to need a lot of help. But in fact, people can be active and continue to contribute in a variety of ways well past that age. Now, you might say, yeah, okay, but, how much longer are you going to go on for? 80, 90, whatever. There certainly will be some limits. So I'm not completely dismissing the issue, but I think that it was somewhat too alarmist. On the question of reducing the average age of the population through immigration, I think that requires that we really meet these pledges that are starting to be made to get to net zero emissions in the affluent countries. Otherwise, you're quite right. If the US takes more immigrants and they move from low income and low emitting countries to the US, and they also then have this 16.5 metric tons of emissions per capita, that will not help the climate change issue at all. So if we're going to increase the population in that way, it points to the greater imperative to reduce our emissions very rapidly.
Paula, you wanted to ask, right?
Okay. Well, one thing is that we shouldn't just talk about biodiversity. There's been like a 60% decline in the population of most mammals, and what right do we have to corner all the others, including the great apes that we discussed yesterday, into these very small areas? But my question is, well, if we had a global market on procreation permits, that would lead to distribution from the rich to the poor, because it's the rich countries that are declining population already. But if we had local markets, that would not have the same effect. So would you be in favor of tradable permits to have tax-free children?
So I think that's the kind of idea that, if you were a philosopher king and you could enforce your wishes, you would do. But I just think it's really completely unrealistic to think that that's going to happen. I can't see politicians doing that, and I don't know quite how you would enforce it if it was going to be done. So yeah, I don't think it's a solution to the issues that we face. I think we have to think of the things that we can actually do that will have an impact. And that's why, as I say, educating girls, maybe improving access to contraception, those kinds of things are what I would emphasize, rather than hoping that somehow we will find not only individual national governments, but an international global arrangement that would be based with permits for reproduction.
Well, I think there's going to be some fiscal policy or other, and some fiscal policies lead to an increase, and others would discourage the increase. So I think, even with, I know that very ambitious programs are unfeasible, but we're going to have one fiscal policy or other. So, I think taking that into account would be...
We may have incentives of various kinds for people to have smaller families. Yeah, that is something that I think got mentioned in one of my slides, and that's possible. Although, even some of those things will obviously be politically contested. But I do think those are things that we can talk about.
You want to ask? No. Oh. Okay.
Is this working?
Yeah, it's working.
I don't know to what extent people here are familiar with Parfit and the repugnant conclusion, but I imagine that for those of you who are not, it's kind of obvious that the world where everybody's living is having sort of like a dull and miserable life. It's obviously worse than a one where there is less population living better lives. And you seem to express sort of like doubts about that. And I wanted to ask you whether you can expand more on your personal views on this, dilemma or situation. Yeah.
Yes, I think you're right that most people's intuitions are that World Z is a worse world than World A. And intuitively, I felt the same when I first was exposed to these arguments, which was a very long time ago, because it was when I was a graduate student at Oxford that I first heard Parfit expand this view. And I spent quite a lot of time trying to find alternatives or reasons why that argument didn't work. But I haven't succeeded, and Parfit himself never succeeded. There is a posthumous article that was published in Philosophy and Public Affairs, which kind of offers a possible solution, but I don't think it works, and most of the other people I know in the area don't think it works. So it's a question of whether you really want to trust your intuitions on this issue, which is not, an issue where it's quite hard to imagine very large numbers of people still having positive lives in the absence of, or rather in opposition to an argument that seems to go through and doesn't seem to have obvious flaws, plus the fact that attempts to find completely different theories, Parfit referred to as the search for theory X, that is a theory that would reconcile our intuitions with the idea, with some plausible view of population that did not have other counterintuitive consequences. And no, I don't think anyone has found theory X. Gustav Arrhenius, who's a Swedish philosopher, has a kind of proof that there can't be any theory X that reconciles all of our intuitions in this area. So that's why I'm at least open to the possibility that World Z is a better world than World A. I'm not going to just say, well, intuitively I know that's wrong, despite the absence of a theory that coheres with most people's intuitions and the absence of a clear understanding of why that argument that I gave you was not valid.
Okay, we should continue with Felix Pinkert. Is that either? I mean, we can since we didn't put a pauses in the program, we can always, have some flexibility between all the sessions today. But at the end, we have a large session just for asking questions to Peter Singer, all kinds of questions. So anyone who still has more questions on population can ask later. I am worried that we are delaying Felix's presentation too much. No? So, okay.
Yeah, yes, of course.
Okay. Is there any way of making this thing disappear at the bottom? No? Okay, too bad. Good. Thank you very much, Peter, for really very interesting and stimulating talk and discussion. And I think, as you already said at the beginning, that what I'm going to talk about next, I think, ties in very nicely into some particular details of what you've said and also makes maybe some more concrete claims, which you might then disagree with. So I think there's a good opportunity for discussion here. So together with my co-author Martin Sticker from the University of Bristol, I've been working on arguments which have to do with the moral obligation to potential moral obligation to have fewer children that many people have argued for because of climate change. So some years ago, this topic really took off also in the public debate. So here's an article from The Guardian. If you want to fight climate change, you should have fewer children. It's one of the more polite articles. There are other articles which say, like, are parents the worst climate sinners? Or where you have a child next to like a huge car and it says that having a child is like driving 50 Audis or something like this. And there also has been academic debate about this, where this topic has been explicitly treated. For example, Travis Reeder argues for a small family ethic, so philosophers, ethicists arguing that in fact we do have an obligation individually to only have a small family, maybe 1 or 2 children. So this is the background for our discussion. And what we tend to do in philosophy is, like, it's nice if you can kind of formulate a clear claim that we agree or disagree with, and the claim that we phrase as our target is what we call proclimate antinatalism. Now that sounds very technical, but let me explain. So the idea is that because of the negative impact of procreation, so of having children on the climate, we have really strong reasons to have fewer children. And so there are other forms of antinatalism which say that, look, our children will have such bad lives in the future, that's why we shouldn't have children for the sake of our children. But here we talk about a reasoning which is for the sake of the climate, right? So because the children are bad for the climate, that's why you shouldn't have them, not because the climate is bad for the children, right? So that's what we call pro-climate antinatalism. For the sake of the climate, we at least have strong reasons to have fewer children. Now, some notes on that. Fewer children can mean no children. It depends on the kind of situation, on the choice that you face. Very important, in contrast to kind of the framing of Peter's talk in many ways, is that what I'm focusing on today and what Martin and I focus on is individual choice. So if you, as an ethical agent, an agent who is concerned with what they ought to do, ask yourself, well, should I have a child or not? Should I have another child or not? What has ethics to say to you in this situation as an individual, to me as an individual? It's not about population policies. Should we take measures which make people decide to have fewer children or so? Right? That's a different question. So here we talk about the individual element as our main focus. Some people have stronger views, they have stronger formulations of pro-climate antinatalism, that you even have a moral obligation or a duty to have at most 1 or 2 children. Today, I'm bracketing that somewhat. It's formulated in terms of reasons. There's a really strong ethical pull to think, well, maybe I'm going to have fewer children. And as Peter pointed out already, so this mostly applies today, the argument only applies to countries with high per capita emissions. So we're not talking about moral obligations that a person in Niger has, for example. You're talking about someone in the United States or in Spain or in the United Kingdom or in Australia, etc. Right? Okay, so in this talk, what do we argue? So we argue that the case that's presented for pro-climate antinatalism is actually much weaker than is previously assumed and that is being presented. We also argue that, well, but it might still be true, right? It might be that it's just weaker than thought. But if it's true that we have these strong reasons to have fewer children, then this is itself a morally bad situation. And because it's a bad situation, we should avoid it. So we have a collective obligation to get to net zero per capita carbon emissions quickly, so that pro-climate antinatalism is rendered false. So we should make it the case that we are morally free to have children, that we don't have to worry about the climate when we decide to have children. And very brief excursion today, because we also talked about food and biodiversity loss, and yesterday we talked about great apes. The same might potentially hold for other negative environmental impacts of having children. The key idea is that we want to take 2 ideas seriously. We want to take seriously the case for pro-climate antinatalism, that we need to talk about population, that there is something to these arguments, right? They are not entirely mistaken or so. So we want to take that seriously. But we also want to take seriously the intuition that many people have that there is something fishy, something unpalatable about this. Somehow we don't quite like it, this talk about that we might have a duty to have fewer children. So we want to take both of that seriously. Okay, so let me get to the first point. The case for pro-climate antinatalism is actually much weaker than is widely assumed. So what's the basis of these claims? It's a seminal article by Paul Murturk and Michael Schlacks, 2 statisticians who run models and calculations about the carbon legacy of individuals. So they model under certain assumption that if you have a child now, what kind of additional emissions come into existence in the future because of your choice. And that's an article in the journal Global Environmental Change in 2009. How does the argument work? Well, in essence, the argument is this. So here's you and your partner or co-parent, and you live your lives, you heat your home, you might drive a car, you might fly to vacations, or whatever it is that you do, and eat exotic fruit, and that leads to CO2 emissions. And now you decide to have a child, well, and they do also these kind of things, right? And that's already, you have as many CO2 emissions than your life. But then that doesn't stop there, right? They might have children of their own who also will live lives, and they will also consume, and so forth. So the idea is that the choice to procreate, the choice to bring a new person into existence, potentially leads to many more emissions than all of your consumption emissions combined. Right? So that's the logic. Now, what kind of numbers come out of this? So here's the kind of scenario. So it's a graph which shows the timeline at the bottom. So we go into the future here. And on the vertical axis, it's the CO2 emissions that every person has in a given year. So here's you're living your life, and you live a certain duration, and that kind of blue square is the total emissions that you create, right? Every year you keep emitting your per capita yearly emissions, and you create a certain amount of additional emissions that way. And now you have a child, and they also live, and they live longer than you, hopefully, and they also have emissions. And then the next generation, and the next, and the next, and the next, and you have like many, many additional emissions. And the key assumption here is that the emissions per capita are constant. That's the key central scenario that these authors present, and that keeps being cited. And the number that comes out of that is that in the United States, you have about 10,000 tons of additional CO2 that you create in the atmosphere by having just one child per parent, right? So in total, it's almost 20,000 tons. So that's a whole lot. You can't really fly that much unless you have a private jet, I guess. Okay, so how does the argument then work for proclimate antinatalism? Well, we have strong reasons to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's just taken as given. But having a child leads to really large amounts of additional greenhouse gas emissions. Right? It's the most significant thing you can possibly do. And hence, you have really strong reasons to have fewer children. Right? So that's the logic of the argument behind proclimate antinatalism. Now, why might that argument be weaker than it's been presented in the literature so far, and also in the public articles that are like the kind of public-facing news articles, opinion pieces, etc.? Well, let's look at the number in some more detail. So first, it's in the US, and that's an important country, and one needs to address people in the US, but it's not the whole world, obviously. But often that number has been cited without this geographical reference, and in Europe already the number will be half. But of course, half of 20,000 tons is still a whole lot. But then there's the assumption that emissions per capita will stay constant indefinitely. And there's a big question mark on that, because that's physically impossible, right? There is not infinite amounts of fossil fuels in the ground. And also, if we do this, then even after a relatively short time, and we have a world which is so apocalyptically bad that it's not quite, and even without much procreation, this world would be extremely terribly bad, and then we might worry about other things than procreation. And it doesn't seem realistic in the first place. And also, if you look at what happened since 2005, so the data of this 2009 article is based on 2005, so it's getting towards 20 years old, is that we already have a reduction of about 1% per year in US emissions. So it already went down, right? And the point now is, well, this 10,000 tons per parent, big question mark, right? This number is kind of, it's a simplified modeling assumption. It makes sense for these authors, right? So they are very transparent about it. But the way this number is being used doesn't actually take into account that this is a modeling exercise, which if you want to have a precise number, you need to do much more work, right? It's more of a proof of concept, actually, what they're doing in the paper. But that's just being ignored. Now, what emissions paths are now possible, right? So should we assume, for example, that these US emissions now stay constant at the 2022 level? Well, why would they, right? I mean, they have decreased. They have decreased already during a time when there wasn't as much of a push to reduce emissions as it is now. So that doesn't seem terribly realistic. So what is now possible? Well, one thing that we talk about, and that's kind of the framework and the background of our talk, is the idea that we need to get to net zero emissions by about the mid-century. And then that's being discussed in many countries. That's being put in law in many countries, and it's considered as law in other countries. Right? So there's a lot of talk about this notion that, yes, we need to get to net zero, and we need to talk about a quite constrained time frame of about mid-century, so 2050. Now, you might think about this what you like. You might think this is just greenwashing, or it's not feasible, or not going to happen. But as ethicists, we think, well, if you make a big effort, it might happen, right? It doesn't seem totally crazy. And so let's consider that, right? Let's just have a look at what happens if we actually did that thing which we are already promising and pledging and putting in law, right? What happens then? So then we have an emissions path which is not like a long horizontal line, but it actually cuts off at 2050, right? That's where it stops with emissions. So this is your first generation, someone born now, say, and they only have these emissions by the age that they are 28 or so, they actually cease to create additional emissions. And the subsequent generations, they just don't have any emissions, right? So doing some maths about this, you end up having 7 years times, or 7 times the 2022 per capita emissions. That's because it's 28 years divided by 2, because this is this nice triangle, and divided by 2 again, because per parent. And in the US, you're talking of 100 tons. In Europe, in the EU, you're talking about less than 50 tons. But that's actually not enough. If we actually took seriously this idea that we get to net zero by 2050, in these 28 years, what happens in those 28 years with the child that you are having now? Right? So suppose you're deciding to have a child now. And that child starts as a baby, I've learned, right? So children don't start as grown-up adults who live outside of your home, and then they're a toddler, a school kid, a teenager, and a young adult. Now, the baby is a bit of a monster baby if it actually generates the same per capita CO2 emissions than a grown-up person. And also, it's like, how are you going to pay for that as a family, right? I mean, what I see from friends who have children, they don't suddenly have an additional income which they can spend on energy-intensive things, right? So you're not going to have these much additional emissions from your baby. That's extremely unlikely. Now, you might also be very stressed, right? So you might decide to buy a car and you cannot really do all your recycling or whatever anymore. So there are also some things which will make you less green if you have a child, potentially. But there's a question, okay, so what is it actually? So this, I draw this dotted line there of what the additional emissions are, and it's dotted because we don't know. The research is extremely inconclusive. It depends on the country, on your income level, etc. So there is probably there are going to be additional emissions. For some people, it might not be the case because they might become more green because they have a child. But the point is that there's going to be some area which is less than these 44 tons if you have a child, which you cause in terms of additional emissions. So it's much less than 44 tons in the EU. So now we're talking of a number which is not the most important thing you ever decide in terms of your CO2 emissions, right? It's not like 10,000 tons versus if you go for a flight around the world where you have 1 ton or something. Now we're talking of something like maybe 20 tons. Still something, but it's not nothing. It's not like that huge. But the question now you might ask, that's really nice and triumphant what you're saying. Well, will we really get to this net zero in 2050, right? So this wonderful graph, it's no guarantee, right? It's not an oracle which predicts the future. And even the UK Parliament itself, right, there's a report from this year which says, well, look, there is a target, but there is just no plan for how to get there. And for example, a Guardian article, headline recently, talking about the investment plans of major fossil fuel companies, which commit us to many more billions tons of emissions. Right? So there's a big question mark of whether we actually get to this net zero or whether this is all just pious talk that we do. So will we get there? Well, if we don't get there, and we keep at the high impact, then, so we argue, proclimate antinatalism is true. You then have strong reasons not to have kids, or should actually say you have strong reasons to have fewer kids. Right? If we get there, then proclimate antinatalism is arguably false. You don't have really strong reasons to have fewer kids. Now we can now think, well, we don't know. As a philosopher, I give you these 2 choices, and now we need to predict the future, and that's it. But actually, whether we get there is up to us, right? It's not a fact of nature whether we get to net zero emissions or not. And once we talk about a choice that we make, then as ethicists, we can ask which choice should we make and how should we evaluate these choices. And that's where our new argument comes in. So we want to argue that actually there is something really bad, additionally bad, that we do if we don't get to these net zero targets quickly. Okay, so there are different responses now you might have to proclimate antinatalism, and I want to present this briefly to then contextualize our argument. So many people feel there's something inappropriate or intrusive about this idea that you have strong reasons to have fewer children. Here's the ethicist coming and telling you that you really need to think hard about having children because of the climate. Many people feel, I feel, there's something weird about this. And now you might say, well, reject proclimate antinatalism and say, look, you philosopher, get out of my life, leave me alone, this is inappropriate. Or you bite the bullet and you say, well, look, sorry, you might not like it, but the situation is this way and there are obligations that you might not like. Too bad. Right? It's just such a serious situation that we need to have fewer children. And our point is different. We say, well, look, unless we drastically reduce emissions, proclimate antinatalism is true. We have strong reasons to have fewer children. We accept that. But we also say it's not just a matter of disliking that, but actually the presence of these reasons, that ethics intrudes on your choice about how many children to have, that's itself a morally bad thing. That should not be the case, and it should be avoided. Why is that? Why is it a bad thing if there are these strong ethical reasons to have fewer children? We say that, well, it has a loss of moral freedom, it leads to a loss of moral freedom, and it leads to what philosophers call moral injury. So how does that work? So moral freedom is the idea that you're more free to do something, some action X, if it's neither forbidden nor obligatory to do it. And you might extend this notion of moral freedom. Well, you're free to do something if there are no strong ethical reasons which pull you one direction rather than the other. It's kind of up to you, right? It's not a business for ethics to tell you, you decide what you do. And in some choices, we have a really strong interest in having this moral freedom. We have an interest in some choices in our life to be determined not by ethics, but by who we are, what our interests are, what our personal ideals are. So we want to express personal desires, ideals, projects, which are essential to our identity. I am a person who is a parent. I want to be a parent, for example. And this works only if the choice is not heavily determined by moral reasons, that I can really express my personal desires and etc. For example, choosing a partner, right? Like if you load this up with a lot of ethics, that's really weird. And there's also ethical discussions about something that is called adiaphora, so things that ethically don't matter and where you're up, it's up to you. Okay. Now, if proclimate antinatalism is true, then there are strong impersonal reasons to have fewer children. So reasons which don't have to do with your personal desires and goals, right? It's ethics coming, and whether you like it or not, there are these strong reasons which push you in one direction rather than the other. And these counterbalance, and they might outweigh your personal reasons and constrain your choice. So your reasons that I want to be someone who cares for a new being, for example. I want to be someone who passes on something to the next generation, etc. That is, you're not free to make your choice just looking at your personal reasons anymore. You need to consider this really strong, heavy ethical reason to do with the climate. So that's the first problem. This is a loss. This is a loss to the way we live our lives. That doesn't mean it's not true, right? There are loads of things which happen which are bad and are a loss and still true. But if proclimate antinatalism is true, then there is a loss. The second point, second problem is moral injury. So moral injury is happening to you if you're in a situation where you necessarily fall far short of one of your ideals. So this literature, or this idea comes from discussion, for example, of social workers or care workers who are just not given the resources to provide adequate care, right? Or have to make really difficult choices which they shouldn't be having to make given that they really care for their patient or the people that they help. But they just have to do it. They have to reject some people's application for benefits, for example, something like that. Now, how does that apply to the climate? So here's a person who has only two things that they want in life. They want to have children, and they don't want to trash the planet, right? These are their ideals. This is really important to them. And now suppose they have children. Well, then they have to say, well, look, I'm wrecking the earth, right? I'm falling short of this ecological ideal. Or they decide not to have children, and then they're like, well, I wish I had kids. But they can't have it both. They can't actually realize they're two very sensible ideals together. It's not possible if proclimate antinatalism is true. So the idea then is to say, look, we have a choice to go on a high emissions path, and then proclimate antinatalism is true, and we lose procreative moral freedom, and we experience moral injury. And that is harmful, and it's a morally bad situation that we cause with our choices. Right? We make it the case. Or we go on a low-impact scenario, for example, net zero by 2050. Then proclimate antinatalism is false. You have procreative moral freedom, and you don't experience this moral injury, and that's a morally good situation that's caused by our collective actions. Now, clearly, we should do this. We should go there by doing this action, and that's what we ought to do. Right? So this is just summing up the argument again. So what's new in this argument? We're a bit short on time, right? Yeah, okay. So we have an additional reasons why we ought to get to net zero quickly. So of course we should get to net zero emissions quickly for all kinds of other reasons, right? Like all the harm that climate change causes. But there's an additional reason here, and it has to do with our freedom to live our lives based on our personal reasons, in this really personal area of procreation, and on not experiencing this moral injury from a conflict of our ideals. We also show there is an additional wrong that we commit when we don't get to net zero quickly. We're not just wronging other species or future generations, but we are also wronging every would-be parent. Right? We're actually imposing on them a situation that is really an imposition. Right? We are wronging young people now, or people who who are potentially parents. And we also show that there are different obligations to reduce emissions, so we ought to reduce not just total emissions, but we ought to reduce per capita emissions. That actually ties into what Peter said earlier, so I'm going to very briefly say something about this. So if you go on a path to reduce absolute emissions, so the total global emissions, by relying on population engineering to make it, so basically you're reducing per capita emissions slower, but you're relying on there being fewer people, so there's a kind of trade-off there. Then you actually leave the carbon impact of having children too high, and then proclimate antinatalism would still hold. So it seems that net zero plans ought to be really net zero per capita plans. Now, beyond climate change, as you might think, now I've only talked about climate change. What about habitat loss for other species, resource use, waste, pollution, overtaxing soil, food, and water supplies? The same argument works. High per capita negative impacts on something X, like biodiversity, they make a form of antinatalism true. For example, pro-biodiversity antinatalism. You have reasons to have fewer children to have, in order to preserve biodiversity. If that's true, that's a morally bad situation and a harm. You ought to avoid bad outcomes and harms, and hence you have a collective obligation to set out on paths that will quickly get us to net zero per capita impacts on the environment. Now, the big question is this really feasible for all impacts? For example, on land use or biodiversity, etc. Right? So that's an empirical question. Okay, so to conclude, we have argued that the case for proclimate antinatalism is already much weaker than is widely assumed. But if proclimate antinatalism is still true, so there's at least some, the reasons might not be as strong, the reasons to have fewer children, but they might still be very strong, then this is itself a morally bad situation. And because it's a bad situation, we ought to avoid it collectively. We have a collective obligation to get to net zero per capita emissions quickly, so that proclimate antinatalism is rendered false, so that we don't have strong climate-based reasons to have fewer children. And the same, at least potentially, holds for other negative environmental impacts of having children. That's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Now Andrew will give Felix a short reply, and so we might still have time for some questions after.
Okay, thank you. My role is essentially that of an insurance policy in case the audience was very shy and didn't have many questions. That's definitely not true, we see now, so I'm redundant. I'll therefore try to be very brief. I'm going to ask two questions to Felix, and then I'll ask a variant of the second question to Peter. The first question I want to ask Felix is really about why he's focused on pro-climate antinatalism rather than another way of dealing with the connection between population and climate. Right? The anti-climate pro-natalist is akin to a kind of command and control position, which asks whether people are permitted to have children, and then defends a particular conclusion about individual moral requirements or individual moral reasons. Now, that's not the only way to think of this kind of problem. As Paula's earlier remark about institutional schemes which involve the distribution of, for example, emission permits. Right? She talked about a variant on that kind of institutional proposal which focused on procreation permits. Right? That's another way to think about this issue. These types of proposals don't say to any particular individual, you're permitted to or have moral reason to have only this number of children. Instead, what they essentially do is adjust the price of emitting activity, or one type of emitting activity, procreative activity, and they raise the price in order to reduce an aggregative variable, total emissions. Right? That's the way you should think about this issue, I think, if you're an economically informed political philosopher. I know Felix is such a political philosopher, and I'm sure Martin is as well. So I'm kind of puzzled why he's focused on this more individualistic, non-institutional type of proposal. The type of view I have in mind will agree with him completely that we should focus on reduction of total emissions and reduction of per capita emissions by sponsoring technical change, for example. But really the question it asks is how to distribute the costs amongst individuals of reducing the total level of emissions. Like, to think about it vividly, imagine we have people, like the people Felix mentioned, who very much want to have large families. And there are other people who love biodiversity and like witnessing it firsthand, so love going on foreign holidays 3 times a year to the most beautiful parts of the planet. And they say, why not treat us neutrally? Why are you trying to reduce the price of having children rather than treat both of these type of emitting activities equitably and be neutral? Like, this is really the second question I'm asking Felix. I think his position really wasn't neutral. It said it's regrettable that anti-climate, pro-climate antinatalism is true, if it is true, because it means that our moral freedom to have children is lower. But the people who like going on holidays are going to say, it's also regrettable if we lack the moral freedom to go on holidays. I think that Felix wasn't treating these positions similarly, and that in a society where there's disagreement amongst reasonable people about the value of these different activities, that's a problem. This leads to my third question, which is directed to Peter. I'm tremendously moved by Peter's work, but I'm moved more by the kind of concrete concerns rather than the more abstract utilitarian rationales for those concerns. And this seemed to me another instance of my kind of discontent with the utilitarian rationale. So think about this concern with optimal population. Supposing we agree that there can be optimal population. It's puzzling to find out what makes a population the optimal population. Nevertheless, we might think, as a matter of global institutional design, these kinds of moral truths shouldn't play any role in our proposals about global institutional design. That was your response, I think, to Paula's proposal about procreation permits. You said that's a philosopher king proposal, and it really isn't going to be feasible to implement it globally. I think the same thing is true about guiding global institutional design based upon truths about optimal population, if there are such truths. It's a philosopher king fantasy. Just like Derek thinks that the decline of religion is a good thing. I agree with him. But I don't think that that should influence the design of local or global political institutions. So I wonder if the concrete concerns you mentioned at the beginning are more relevant to institutional design than the utilitarianism. But thank you.
Okay, we're going to eat a little bit into the next session, but Peter had told me he doesn't require a lot of time for the presentation of his second book. So would you like to answer, or would you like to answer first, this last one? Or shall I ask Felix?
Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you very much, Andrew, for these really, really insightful questions. So the first question about, so why focus on the individual level rather than the institutional one? I mean, one way of reading is, so why don't you do a different project? But I think, the individual question is important, right? I mean, people use carbon footprint calculators to make individual choices. And as much as I'm interested in politics, I'm also interested in individual ethics. What ought I to do now? And the whole kind of discussion came about from a very individual perspective. I was visiting Martin in Dublin, and I took a train there and the ship there from England, and he was like, well, I fly a lot, but at least I don't have children. And I'm like, well, does this really work, right? And it really started on this individual level, and I think that's important and a task for ethicists to deal with. And a lot of the discussions, for example, right, this Guardian headline that I've shown you, it's about individual choices, right? It's like, if you want to save the climate, you should have fewer children. Right? It's addressing individuals, and I think it's legitimate for philosophers to deal with that. But of course, there's also the question of institutionally. So what should we do? And do the same arguments apply there, or maybe other arguments? Right? So it might make a difference, or it will make a difference whether we talk about what we institutionally do than what I ought to do. So what the state ought to do to influence all of us, say. And I think here one can run an argument not that dissimilar from the argument we've been running in the paper, and that's, so suppose that we put a price on having a child, and which is based on a predicted future emissions. And you have to pay that price upfront if you want to have a child. It's a big question whether you should do that or whether your child shouldn't be paying once they emit, actually. We've talked about this earlier, Andrew. But suppose that we ask parents to do that. Well, then by setting out on a high emissions path, we keep the price of having children very high. If we commit to a low emissions path, we set the price of having children very low. And now we can ask a question whether a world in which it's really expensive to have a child is the kind of world that we want, and that's ethically a good world. Or whether you think that, well, there are now very strong financial considerations and constraints, even stronger than those which already exist, because having a child is economically very burdensome anyway. But whether it's really the kind of world where we want, where you really have to look into your bank account before you decide to have a child, even more so, and you need to make sure that there are huge amounts of money in there. And we might think, well, look, this is also a restriction of a kind of procreative freedom. It's not restrained by ethical considerations, but it's constrained by budgetary considerations. And you might argue, and I would argue that, well, we should keep these lower if we can, because that allows us to more freely express who we are and not just to express how much money I have. So I think that would be my response to that, so that the argument still would hold that there would be a kind of procreative freedom argument for going to net zero very quickly. Now, what about this question of neutrality? So yes, there is a point in here where we don't treat every kind of life project equal. Right? We say there's something, and that's why like, there's some essential projects which is important to realize or not. And now, well, I really like mountains. It's good that I live in Austria. I would really like to see the Himalayas. I'm not sure that I ever will in my life if there are no travel options or have loads of time to get there low carbon. That's a loss to my life, but it's okay. I don't think it's commensurable to like saying that, well, it's just not okay for me to have a child, for example. Why is that? Because I'm thinking in terms of capabilities and Amartya Sen framework, right? So if I would not have any opportunity to somehow enjoy and interact with the natural environment of our wonderful planet or with biodiversity, that would really be a very significant loss. Right? Saying like, well, you're not ever going to see any non-human animal, right? I mean, that is asking too much. Do I need to see every possible species on the planet or some tropical fish in order to realize my interest in kind of interspecies relations and interaction with the planet? I don't think so. So there is the one is a matter of degree, while the other one is a matter of whether the capability is realizable at all. And so that would be my argument there. So acknowledging that there are other valuable goods, but they're not in the same way endangered by kind of the need to reduce emissions.
Yes, okay, thanks very much. So I certainly, you know, in a way I'm quite happy if you're persuaded by the concrete issues that I raise.
Peter, can you use the microphone, please? Thanks.
Yeah, so in a way I'm quite happy if Andrew is persuaded by the concrete factors that I talk about for discussing climate change and possibly the policies that I suggested in response to Nuria's question. You know, and obviously philosophers like to argue about utilitarianism versus other approaches, and we can do that. So, yeah, that's okay. But I think it's, in a way, it's a little hard not to get into discussions of what's an optimum population if you're going to have policies, because policies will implicitly assume something. And in fact, a lot of people do assume when you raise questions of population that what we should be aiming for is the highest average level of well-being. Actually, what they usually assume is the highest average level of human well-being because, as we were saying yesterday, they don't really think very much about non-human animals, but I entirely agree that we should, and actually I entirely accept Paula's correction that it's not just the value of biodiversity loss in the sense of there being no more white rhinos or whatever it might be, but it's the loss to individual animals whose habitats are destroyed and who have worse lives or die slowly because of that. So I agree with that. But in terms of policies, if we are assuming that the best population policy is the one that will lead to the highest average population, highest average well-being, then I'm not sure that that's right. And there might be a case for saying that if we can avoid the various bad consequences, it's a good thing that population grows, even if that means a lower average, as long as the average well-being stays positive. And you could argue, you know, you could throw in other things like as long as it doesn't make the worst off people even worse off, a whole range of things. But I think the question of, you know, for example, governments will decide, are we going to give people incentives to have more children or not? And if that decision is based on the idea that, well, we shouldn't give incentives because if we give people incentives to have more children, the average level of well-being will fall, even though we're having this discussion, let's say, in an affluent country, and let's say, to avoid the greenhouse complications, an affluent country that has achieved net zero emissions, you know, then I think we might want to say, hey, well, wait a minute, even if average falls, people are quite well off in this country, extra people coming into existence will enjoy their lives. Doesn't that compensate in some way for the fact that the average level has fallen? If not, why not? You know, so I think that at some point those kinds of questions can't really be avoided. Yeah, maybe philosophers are not going to have a big impact in those discussions, and maybe it will just be people swapping intuitions. But I don't think the issues can simply be. I don't think you can simply say we're not going to discuss those issues because they're there implicitly in the policies that we make.
Somebody wants to ask Felix a question, or yeah, Íñigo.
Yeah, I have a question for Felix. I was wondering how your view applies, if at all, to begin with, to those who have no interest whatsoever in procreating. Because it seems to me that in a scenario of high per capita emissions, these people would not be liable to moral injury to begin with, and depending on how you define freedom, their moral freedom might not be undermined. So my question is, are these people left off the hook in the sense that they have no reason, or at least not of the sort that you have offered in your presentation, to reduce their emissions? Or perhaps they might have reasons based on trying to avoid that other people who might have an interest in having children are not liable to moral injury, or their moral freedom is not undermined.
Thank you. Great question. The latter, the second option that you offered to me, is what I would subscribe to. So a person who has no personal interest in having children doesn't experience the kind of moral injury, the conflict of ideals, because they might only have the ideal to preserve the planet and not also to have children. Whether they experience a loss of moral freedom, it's tricky. So in a sense, their choice not to have children is overdetermined. So they have a really strong ethical reason to have fewer children. If fewer than one is 0, right? So they have no children. And they also have this really strong personal reason. And now you might say, well, look, the fact that there's this additional reason. Yeah, so I think we can argue about that, whether it's kind of taking away the expressive power of their choice or not. But it doesn't mean that they don't have anything to do with this collective obligation to make it the case that those people who do have taken strong interest in having at least one child don't experience moral injury or a loss of procreative moral freedom, simply because it's a harm that's being inflicted on them. Right? So to say that it's so important for me that I have my luxury lifestyle and I don't really want any kind of emissions reductions, I vote against them, say. If I do that, I basically make it a case that this other person who takes an interest in this, a very legitimate interest in raising a family, finds themselves in this injurious situation, and I should not contribute to that. Yeah.
Yes, Diego.
My question is more focused on wealthiest ones, because I was reading an article that by 2015, 10% of wealthiest ones are responsible almost for half of the emissions. So shouldn't we focus also on taxation or the options how to cut the carbon footprint of the wealthiest population?
Yes, we should, but it doesn't really. It's just that's an additional point, right? So you can affirm that next to all that I've said, right? So this is just one of the one of the reasons to get to net zero per capita emissions quickly is this issue of moral freedom to have children and this issue of moral injury. But of course, there are all kinds of other reasons that we have, namely that climate change leads to a lot of bad effects. And of course, yeah, if taxation works for that, then that's to reduce that, then we should do that, yeah.
Diego, this person at the front here.
Hi. Yeah, so I have an argument slightly in favor and another slightly against your points. So the one, and I want to know how valuable you think they are. Like, another argument in favor of what you're saying, therefore against proclimate antinatalism, would be that having children is actually a motivation for people to think about the long term. So I don't know how valuable do you think that is as an argument. And the argument slightly against is that I see that in these conversations, usually people do not mention the option of adopting kids. And I think to some extent there is possibly, to some extent, a moral incentive to do so, because there are children that are being born in bad situations, and they could have a better life if they're adopted from people from better countries. So I want to know your opinion on this.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Let me start with the second point. I think this is a really nice point about adoption that we can actually use to strengthen our argument, right? Because you have a strong pro-climate reason not to adopt a child from a poor country, because then they will be raised as a rich person, as a relatively rich person. It's pretty much, in terms of the climate, pretty much equivalent to bring a new person into existence if it's the case that if you were not to adopt them, they would continue to live in poverty. Of course, this is not the kind of reason one should be considering, right? But the argument for pro-climate antinatalism actually places this reason in front of you. And that is morally really weird and not the kind of reason that should be there in the first place. And it can be removed by making it the case that you can help lift someone out of poverty without thereby also significantly contributing to climate change. About this idea that, so we don't argue against pro-climate antinatalism being true, right? So that's, need to clarify that. It's a bit tricky, the point that we're making, right? We say that, well, under certain conditions, it's true that there are these strong reasons to have children and not to have fewer children. But that's bad. But things can be morally bad without being false, right? So like some bad thing happens and that's morally bad, but it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And so the idea is that we're not saying that the claim is false. We're saying it's a regrettable truth if it becomes true. Now, this idea of having children so that you care for the future, I mean, it really depends on what the evidence on that is. I'm not totally convinced that the long-term future is really what one does, because parenting also wires one to particularly care for one's child. That's kind of essential for being a good parent. It's not clear that caring for the year 2200 is among of the things that you start doing by having a child, while even without having a child, you might care a lot about the future. Like for me, it was quite striking to realize that my godchildren are not unlikely to live until the year 2100, which is where all these climate predictions go, and then suddenly it becomes a very live reality when you see them, and that it works even if they're not your own children. So I'm not totally convinced that this is something that we need to consider here.
Yeah, I wanted to point out the same topic related to the adoption, and I taking profit of, it has been mentioned, going beyond of speaking about adopting. Do you consider viable to just connect the desire of people of having children and being aware of the climate impact of having children with the institutional support to do it? I mean, nowadays the fact of adopting children, it can be a hard way to do things. So maybe if people is more aware about this option instead, and it's easier to do it, maybe they are more motivated to just adopt instead of having new babies and taking new lives and increasing the global impact and the global emissions per capita. So I don't know if you have any data about how this is viable to just give more institutional support, and I don't know, even create a data about people who is interested and is also aware of that and who receives a support and takes more attention to, yeah.
Good, great, thanks. Yeah. Okay, yeah, I try to, yeah, very quickly. Okay, so I think, yeah, that kind of argument, that can work well, especially for domestic adoption, right? To say, well, here's someone who already lives in your high per capita emissions country. They will have a much better life if they get adopted by this new family. It also means that one less person in this, for now, for the time being, one less person will be there in this high-emitting country. And that would be, of course, a good thing to do also for that reason. Yeah.
Okay, we just take 3 minutes or so if you want to stretch your legs, and then we go into the presentation of Peter and Oscar's books.